Over the last 4 years, I've been on a journey, an itinerary of destruction through Ghost Britain, resurrecting those places that have slipped through the fingers of history to give a truer sense of the progress of time and to provide an awful premonition of the future. It's taken me all around the country, but I find myself here on a beach in East Sussex. To my left, we have the beautifully silhouetted cliffs of Fairlight, and to my right, the great shingle promontory of Dungeness, where you can just make out a nuclear power station on its tip, and we're going to go there in a sec. And behind me, we have the drowned medieval city of Old Winchelsea. Old Winchelsea was once one of the principal ports of southern England, a tagliatelle of twisting, winding streets, parcelled in seawater, an emporium of salt, timber, herring and wine. Inauspiciously, given later events, it was built on a giant shingle spit, which was accreted when the headland suddenly changed course, which is where the nuclear power station is today. That's what gives it its name, Winchelsea. It means island on the bend, not, as contemporaries thought, Winchelsea. Now, it may seem like a strange thing to have done, to have built an entire city on a shingle spit, but at the time it would not have seemed that way. It would have seemed like an incredibly firm foundation, and one that gave you unrivaled access to that aquatic highway of commerce, the sea. And just as today, you can see there are all sorts of strange buildings on this great shingle promontory, so there were then. Little did they know that disaster was in store. Chroniclers report how, on that last fateful storm of 1288, the sun vanished from view, the sky turned black, and Old Winchelsea, which was once behind me, was lost in the undulating mountains of the sea and the fire that blazed black. The sea burst through its shingle retainer, washing away entire villages on the great shingle promontory of Dungeness, and all the way as far north as a place called Appledore, which was a quagmire, then 8 miles inland. And this entire landscape, which you can see behind me now, the verdant fields and the gently undulating meadows, was then just a great, muddy, watery wasteland. And it must have been an abominable scene that greeted the survivors of Old Winchelsea as they inched their way down the wooded hill, and they saw through the haze of salt spray their entire town dissolved in the sea, a ruin of roof beams and battered hulls and windmills and horses and pigs and dogs and hawks and even the corpses of men, women and children, all revolving in a great muddy swirl. That's what had become of Old Winchelsea. The last we ever hear from it is a quitclaim of 1291, and then it vanishes from the historical record altogether, only to reappear in later maps as a shadowy blotch several miles out to sea. I couldn't help wondering whether the bell ringers of the medieval church of St Andrew's Fairlight could ever see the old city at low tide rearing from the deep. And it was enchanting to imagine it all out there, all the streets, alleys, lanes, houses, graveyards and owl sanctuaries, mouldering beneath the rippling waves of the narrow seas. The truth is, no one really knows exactly where Old Winchelsea is. Because it was built on a shingle spit, it was dispersed in 1,000 different directions. But although Old Winchelsea's race beneath the sun was over, the King, Edward I, hadn't quite given up on it. He decided to save it, to resurrect it, to, like a precious relic in a cathedral, translate it to a new site on a hill several miles inland, safe from the ravages of the sea that had laid low its predecessor. And so Old Winchelsea would become New Winchelsea, the city that came back from the dead. The first thing you notice when you get off the train to Winchelsea, it's quite hard not to notice, is that it doesn't actually have a station. I mean, like, this is it. It's just a platform. I was expecting something a bit grander. I was expecting at the very least a sign, but it doesn't even have that. I mean, I guess this is where the sign is meant to be, but it's not there. It's just a kind of block of absence. Perhaps that's fitting. So it's a very clear day, and across that field, it's very easy to make out the ancient hilltop port of Rye, and that actually shared a broad tidal estuary with Winchelsea, and that's the reason that both towns were able to rise to such prosperity, because ships from all over Europe would dock. And I have to admit, I'm not quite sure how I'm gonna get across that estuary. It's a nice day, but I'm not gonna swim. But you know, fortune favours the bold, and we'll see if I can find a way across. Well, believe it or not, this is it. That thing. You know, I was expecting a broad tidal estuary, and I've been presented with what can only be described as a dismal little stream. I don't know if you can see it, but you can certainly feel it. There's an emptiness. Something's missing, I'm not quite sure what. And behind me, you can see the hill upon which New Winchelsea was built. So perhaps there's some more clues up there. So we're staring out at the site of Old Winchelsea, and I'm standing on a hill. Looming over me is the gate to the new city, and approaching this would have been quite a frightening experience for would-be invaders, of which there were many. They might have seen eyeballs peeping out of these murder holes and stones being catapulted from above to dash their brains out. If we go under the gate now, we can take a little right, and immediately you can feel the sort of gridiron layout, which has still been preserved in its way as we enter what was once the city of New Winchelsea, but quite clearly has become something else. As you walk the streets of New Winchelsea, something you see quite a lot of are these little openings jutting out into the street. And these were once incredible wine cellars that were alive with lute music and candlelit gargoyles and merchants from all over Europe, piercing barrels of delicious Gascon rosé and watching it spurt out down the throat of those who were there to taste it. Now there's only about 30 left, but it's thought that there were 70 back in the day. Along with the Monday market, one of the original focal points of New Winchelsea was this church here, the Church of St Thomas, and it's thought that some of that stone was salvaged from the original St Thomas in Old Winchelsea. The more we look at the Church of St Thomas, with its ruined transepts and its rather gargantuan nave that still survives, the more curiously out of proportion it seems with the rest of the village. This is another thing that feels weird about this place. It's got an absolutely giant church that feels more like a cathedral. It has to be said that although it's beautifully picturesque, very calm and tranquil, there's something a little bit weird about New Winchelsea. For somewhere that was founded on a booming trading city with Gascony, with other places in England, there's virtually no sign of commerce here whatsoever. There's just one pub in the place of the 90 lively wine caves that were once on pretty much on every street corner, and there's only one absolutely tiny village shop on the other side of this churchyard. And it's kind of dead. I mean, to say it's sleepy is something of an understatement. Comatose would be a better word. You hardly ever see anybody else, and it's always so deadly silent, apart from the traffic and apart from the birdsong. You almost feel as though you are a ghost stalking New Winchelsea, or what New Winchelsea has become. So believe it or not, this beautifully illuminated green field was once the centre of town. This was the marketplace. This is where you would have found people touting tickets to the shrines of St Mary Compostela. This is where you would have found the cats sinking their teeth into the rotting entrails that had been discarded by butchers. This is where you would have found coconut shells full of the most delicious Malmsey wine. This is where you would have found the prostitutes in their striped cloaks. This is where you could have gone to buy belt buckles and sword blades and more. It's now just an empty field. The marketplace effaced from the memory of the city. Who knows what wayfarers, what invalids stared up in agony at this hospital wall. And it's quite unsettling to walk over these fields because you're constantly aware underfoot of these strange bumps and dips and grooves. And these are, of course, the buried foundations of the wine cellars, of the first floors, of the ground floors. And as Daniel Defoe said, when he visited exactly 300 years ago to write his tour through the whole island of Great Britain, he said that the grass has made good cornfields of the street. And what we're walking through now are the ghost streets of New Winchelsea. And all we can see is a great big vast swaddling cloth of nothingness. And of all the haunting sights of New Winchelsea, it must surely be this which truly makes the soul quiver. For this was once one of the main entranceways to the city. And now look at it. It's stranded in these lonely green fields, a testament to what a spectral echo New Winchelsea is of its former self. All of which begs the question, what on earth happened to this medieval city that had such swagger and bravura? What happened to the city that came back from the dead? Well, great misfortunes lay in store for New Winchelsea. It was battered, as so many places were, during the Black Death from 1348. And then in the middle of the 14th century, it was raided, not once, not twice, not 3 times, but more times even than that, by the French and by the Castilians. And one particularly savage raid occurred in the year 1360, when 2,000 Frenchmen galloped into the new city, burning most of it to the ground. They then rounded up the men, the women, the children, who had taken shelter in St. Giles's Church, which has now long since vanished. The French came in, grabbed, as the chroniclers put it, the most attractive women and raped them in the church. They kidnapped the children and put the men to the sword, lay them out in this terrible line of twisted, bloody corpses, which gave its name to the later street, Dead Man's Place, which is now known as Hogtrough's Lane. Much of New Winchelsea lay in ruins. Now that need not have been the final death knell. Other cities were ransacked, they bounced back. But what New Winchelsea couldn't cope with, even in its new reclad form, was the card that it was dealt yet again by nature. For having drowned the predecessor city, nature went on to play a particularly cruel trick, whereby a new accumulation of shingle blocked the harbour. The economic lifeblood of New Winchelsea drained away. The whole thing was exsanguinated. By the time 1415 comes around, the authorities decide to guillotine it where 4th Street was, where I was standing earlier, and people hemorrhage out. The process continues. The city goes into an inexorable decline until, as Daniel Defoe put it, in the year 1722, nothing of the city but the destruction of it seems to remain.